Hello crafters, this is Yana Smakula. Welcome back to my channel. With Mother's Day being not too far away and my complete lack of Mother's Day cards, I decided to make a few. Here's a look at the two Mother Day card ideas I have for you. Both feature some stamping, die cutting, and dry embossing using stencils. Now, the star of the show on these cards are the absolutely gorgeous spring flowers from Pretty Pink Posh. Pretty Pink Posh is known for their cute critter stamps, but they also have a fantastic lineup of all year round flower stamps. One of the newest additions to their floral stamp line is the daffodil set with the pretty spring daffodils. You have two individual flowers and one floral cluster, as well as separate stems and leaves so that you can arrange those and build your floral clusters however you like. Another new stamp set is the Mom set. Now, it's not a floral set, but it's one of the stamp sets that I'll be using to make the cards today. This is the newest addition to the large floral word stamps from Pretty Pink Posh. You have the large focal mom here, as well as the sub-sentiments that read, "Thanks for all you do," and "Happy Mother's Day." And also there is another larger scripty Mother's Day sentiment. Now, the main mom word has a large coordinating die, which can also be used alone, not necessarily with the stamp, and I'll show you that in today's video. Next floral stamp set is the Crocus Flowers set. It's actually one of my favorites for spring, as I love to color these very pale purple or even violet color. These make great additions to spring bouquets. The next stamp set is the Cherry Blossom set, and I actually typically use just one little flower bud from this set. I love the size and the shape of this image, and I actually tend to use it for nearly all of my floral arrangements. Next up is the Tulip set. This one features beautiful, large tulip images along with separate leaves to help you build your own tulip arrangements, and I actually have a separate video on my YouTube channel showing a different way to color these tulips, a very non-traditional way to color these, and I'll link that video here. And last but not least is the Wild Rose stamp set. This isn't necessarily a spring floral set, but I have found these two little roses to complement my floral cards nicely. So let's get started. I went ahead and I stamped a bunch of images in Memento Tuxedo Black ink onto Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I used coordinating dies to cut these images out. You can see some of them on the screen now. Now, my idea was to try and combine these images into one floral arrangement. I wanted to show you that you can pull floral stamps from various stamp sets and combine them together to create unique floral clusters. I love that the size of these works together. Now, they're not all perfectly sized to go together, but they do work together nicely, and I love that. So here I'm just playing around with all of the stamped and die cut images, and I am arranging them to create a floral cluster. You can see how easily it comes together because you have the stems, you have the leaves, you have the different size flowers. It just looks really pretty, and that's one card idea that you have there for a beautiful and spring card. It doesn't have to be a Mother's Day card. It can be just a friendship card or even a spring birthday card, whatever you need or like. Next, I used my Copic markers and I colored these images. I opted to do some very quick and easy coloring. I didn't want to spend too much time coloring these flowers as I did have quite a lot of die cuts, so I opted for some simple flick style Copic coloring. I used Y35, Y13, and Y11 markers to color the daffodils yellow. I wanted my daffodils to have yellow petals and a white flower center, so I used a W1 marker for the flower center just to add some shading and create the illusion of the folds of that center element. Next, I used a variety of colors to color the leaves and the stems, although I actually ended up not using the stems as much, but I still saved them for some future projects. So here, for example, I used a YG00, a YG01, and a YG03 marker. Next, to color the stems on the tulips and also the tulip leaves, I used the YG01 as my lightest color, YG03 as my medium color, and YG17 as the darkest color. So I simply tried to variate different Copic markers, different shades, the intensity of the color to have different shades of green for my floral arrangements. Now here I started with the YG03 as my lightest color to color these leaves. Next, I used YG17 to add the medium color and YG67 to add the darkest color. And as you can tell, I'm doing very simple, very quick flick style coloring to apply color to these images. Now to color the crocuses, these are my favorites. I used BV000 and you can see me simply flicking the color onto the petals. I'm actually not even coloring the entire image. I'm making sure to keep the tip of the petals almost white, so I'm not even extending the color all the way to the tip of the petal. Next, I'm using BV00 as my medium color, and then coming in with BV11 as my darkest color. And this gives me a very nice, very pale lilac coloring to these crocuses. I also use the same colors to color the open crocus flowers. So the same BV000, BV00, and BV11 markers. You could also use a little bit of yellow for the flower centers, but I opted not to add any yellow in the center. Now here we have the wild roses, and for this I used E000. I very much like this almost a pale peach color. And then I used E00 and E02. Although later I added a few additional wild roses to my cards, and I skipped using that last color, the E02, because I didn't like how much peach it added to the flower. So I just used the E000 and the E00 for some of those. Next, once again, I colored some of the grass pieces. Now, this particular image comes from the Crocuses Stem set, and here I used the YG03 as the lightest color, then YG17 as the medium color, and YG67 as the darkest color. So I'm pretty much sticking to the same color of markers, but I am mixing them up a little bit to have different shades and different variations of color. Now for the tulips, I used RV00 as my lightest color. And again, this is very similar to the crocuses. I'm flicking the color, but I'm not coloring the entire petal. Next, I used the RV10 to add a little bit more color, and this actually worked as my medium and also as my darkest color. I just didn't want to add another darker color to the very pale pink tulips. I did color my tulips in two different ways, although you can see those here. Some were colored very vibrant pink. I didn't quite like that, and I ended up not using those. So I just went ahead and I worked with the paler tulips. Now, I did take a picture of that floral arrangement that I practiced at the beginning of this video, and I pulled it up on my phone just to show you how you can arrange all of these flowers now that they're colored and create a very colorful, very fresh spring bouquet. I love that floral stem sets from Pretty Pink Posh work together and coordinate because this allows me to be a lot more creative with the stamps that I already have in my stash. And now having daffodils in the new release, this allows me to complement this floral cluster perfectly. Okay, let's start working on our card. With all my flowers colored, I went ahead and I used one of the sub-sentiments from the Mom stamp set, and I stamped it in VersaFine Onyx Black ink onto the same Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I went with one that reads Happy Mother's Day, and then I just cut it out to a skinny strip banner that I was planning to foam mount across a very bold and big die-cut Mom. So here you can see the stamp set with the word Mom, and you also have a large Mom coordinating die. I wanted to use just the die on its own without the stamping, as I wanted to embellish the die cut letters with the florals that we just created. So I cut these words out from pink cardstock. Here you can see the panel. And I actually tried to do this so that I could use both the positive and the negative letters. So I made sure to center the word on the panel. This panel is cut to 4¼ by 5½ inches. And I die cut the letters that spell mom. I haven't used the negative panel yet, but I am saving it for a future project. Maybe if there's time, I'll try to whip up another Mother's Day card, or it doesn't even necessarily have to be a Mother's Day card. It can be a card for mom. It could be a thank you card for a mom, or I miss you card for a mom, or even a birthday card for a mom. So not necessarily a Mother's Day card. To add a little bit of interest to the die cut letters, I pulled out my white pigment ink and my ink blending tool, and I just ink blended a little bit of that white at the top of the letters. So there's a little bit of a gradient happening. The top of the letters are lighter, and then you have a little bit of more pink towards the bottom. So there's a very, very slight gradient, but it's there, and it adds a little bit of interest to the die cut letters. Now, to create a background for this card, I wanted to use one of the new stencils from Pretty Pink Posh. And one of the things I love to do with stencils is dry embossing. It's actually one of the easiest ways to use the stencils, and it's a quite fun way to use the stencils. So I pulled out my die cutting machine. This is Spellbinders Platinum 6 die cutting machine. It's in a teal color because it was a special edition Jane Davenport machine, but it's basically the same as the Platinum 6. I have my base platform. I've placed my tin embossing mat, and then I position my paper in the stencil. So I first have the paper, and then I place the stencil on top. I also covered this with an embossing plate, and I send that through my die cutting machine to emboss. Now, when you emboss with a stencil, you're not going to get as deep of an embossing as you do with embossing folders, just because stencils are not designed to give you that deep of an emboss, but you do get a bit of texture, which is really nice, and it adds interest to your cards. I always love to add this type of subtle texture to my projects. And I dry embossed backgrounds using the stencils for both of my cards today, and I'll link the stencil names in the video description. So here's what my card looks like so far. I have the letters that spell the word mom. I've created little floral arrangements on both sides of the mom die cut. And now I'm using foam adhesive squares, and I'm going to foam mount my floral clusters over the letters. Now, the floral clusters are going to disguise that die cut mom quite a bit, so it might not be legible in the end. But I do have the sub-sentiment that says Happy Mother's Day. So the large die cut letters that spell the word mom are more of a design element. They're not necessarily there for you to be able to read mom. They're just a design element and a placeholder for the florals. So I used foam adhesive squares to foam mount the clusters onto the letters. I actually found it much easier to use tape. This is Spellbinders Best Ever Craft Tape to secure my cluster together so that I didn't have to adhere each flower one by one. I build my cluster, then I place the tape on top, which allowed me to pick up the entire cluster and then add foam adhesive from the back, again, without having to adhere each floral piece separately. I also added foam adhesive behind the die cut letters because I wanted to pop those up on my background. I love to add a lot of dimension to my projects, so you'll typically see me using a lot of foam squares, a lot of foam adhesive on my cards, just because I prefer my cards dimensional. And since this is a Mother's Day card for my mom, I will be hand delivering it, so I'm not concerned about mailing and keeping this card on the flatter side. I pulled out my grid paper pad. I like to use this so that I can make sure I align things and I can make sure things are positioned straight and evenly on my backgrounds. I taped it down to that grid paper pad, and I also have my Misty ruler, which I'm using to make sure I adhere the die cut letters perfectly straight and perfectly centered on this background. It's a neat trick because when I try to eyeball things, it looks fine, but then I go to give the card to somebody and then I notice that, well, it's not fine. It's a little bit crooked. That bothers me. So that's why I'm using this trick with the grid paper and the ruler. I also foam mounted the sub-sentiment over the word mom, and so my card says, Mom, Happy Mother's Day. Now, I trimmed my background, my embossed background, down slightly. It measures 5.5 by 4 inches, so I trimmed about a 1/4 inch off. I also cut thin strips from pink cardstock, and I adhered those strips onto my card base at the top and at the bottom to have a little bit of pink peeking from behind the background. I then used foam adhesive squares and foam mounted my entire background and entire floral cluster onto that card. And I love the way this looks. So you have a little bit of pink on the die cut letters, and you also have a little bit of pink on the background. Finally, to embellish this card, I used my favorite sparkling clear jewels from Pretty Pink Posh, and I went rather generous with the jewels on this card. I scattered a bunch of them. I have them scattered across the word mom, also across some of the florals, and across the background as well. So here's a look at the first card created with the floral stamp sets from Pretty Pink Posh. Now, I had some leftover flowers, and that led me to another card idea that I have for you today. I dry embossed another background. I pre-planned the floral placement. You can see that photo of that floral placement that I took with my phone. I also heat embossed a sentiment. So this one reads, Happy Mother's Day. It's that scripty sentiment from the same mom stamp set. I heat embossed it on white on light pink cardstock, and I'm going to start with a sentiment. So when I first pre-planned that floral arrangement, I did not account for a sentiment, and that's usually not the best idea because if you want to include a rather larger sentiment on your card, it's always best to start with that sentiment because if you do the background first, you will end up finding that you have no room for the sentiment. So if you plan to use a larger sentiment, start with that larger sentiment first and then build the images around it. So here I foam mounted the sentiment onto my background, and now I'm using the photo on my phone as a guide to recreate that floral cluster. So again, I have all of my images. These are the same florals that I used for the previous card. I did have to stamp and color and cut out a few additionals. Overall, my idea for this card was to create a beautiful spring floral pattern that surrounds a simple Mother's Day sentiment. So I placed the images on the background, and once I was happy with the placement, I used foam adhesive for the most part and just a little bit of glue here and there to adhere all of these elements in place. This is one of my favorite things when it comes to stamping and floral images. I love to create my own custom floral backgrounds, and having the floral stamps from Pretty Pink Posh, this allows me to do that very easily, and it allows me to create custom and unique backgrounds and unique floral combinations for my projects. Next, I used my scissors and I trimmed the overhang off, and that pretty much created or finished my card. Once again, I adhered this background onto an A2 white side folding card base, and once again I used the same jewels, Pretty Pink Posh sparkling clear jewels, to embellish this card. I love how the jewels add interest in how they sparkle on the finished project. So here's a look at both of the cards I have for you today, created with the Pretty Pink Posh floral stamps and the new mom stamp and die set. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for joining me today. Love you guys. If you have questions about any of the cards or any of the techniques that I shared today, please leave them in the comments below. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.